We're going to be starting another lesson on faith. This one is going to be called Recovered Faith. And it's going to be Luke 8:26 to 36. And if you'd like to turn to your Bibles, let's read that now. Then they is Jesus and the disciples. Right before this happened, he was in a boat crossing the Sea of Galilee. And that's when the storm came up and the disciples were extremely scared. Jesus was asleep in the back of the boat, didn't bother him any. But they woke him up and said, "Save us." And that's when Jesus spoke and calmed the seas and calmed the wind. And this is fairly early in his work in Galilee, and the disciples were wondering, well, what type of man is this that can even control nature? So we're still finding a lot about Jesus, and they were too, about all the powers that he had. But they were in this boat and they're crossing the Sea of Galilee. Then they arrived at the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. Now the Gerasenes are Gentiles. As he stepped out on land, a man of the city who had demons met him. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he did not live in a house but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he fell down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me. For Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many times it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the wilds. Jesus then asked him, What is your name? He said, Legion, for many demons had entered him. They begged him not to order them to go back into the abyss. And the abyss, of course, is hell. It's the place set aside for Satan and the demons at some point in time in the future when Jesus comes again. But they knew about it, and they knew they were going there, and now they're begging him not to send them back before their time. Now there on the hillside, a large herd of swine was feeding, and the demons begged Jesus to let them enter these. So he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. When the swineherds, and I guess these would be the people taking care of the herd of swines, saw what had happened, they ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came out to see what had happened. And when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. Those who had seen it told them how the one who had been possessed by demons had been healed. Then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat and returned. The man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with him, but Jesus sent him away, saying, Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you. So he went away, proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him. When Jesus healed, and especially when he cast out demons, they have recovered faith. Whether they had faith before and recovered it, or whether they have recovered from that episode and they now have faith. But it is recovered faith, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. This is a kind of an interesting lesson in that we see things here that we've never seen before, and we'll get into that as we go along. One of the things that I want to do now is to go and show you what Galilee. I got a map on the next slide. So we got Galilee. Several things I like to point out. Sea of Galilee, and there is Gerasa, and we're talking about the Gerasenes. This is the city that they're talking about. It's up in this area. Most of the scholars that I've read in this lesson said this is where it has to be because that's hilly. The rest of the area around is not hilly, and you need a steep slope for the swine to run down into the sea. So it's pretty much limited to right in this area. The other thing I want to point out to you is, of course, here is Nazareth, Sepphoris. Now, Sepphoris, you might remember, when Jesus was a boy growing up, Sepphoris was the home of Herod Antipas, and Herod Antipas made Sepphoris the capital of Galilee. Now, when Jesus grew up and started his ministry, then the capital moved over to Tiberias. While Herod Antipas was living here, he was building Tiberias. And as soon as Tiberias was finished, then he moved over there. Jesus very seldom ever journeyed close to Tiberias. He had no use for Herod Antipas, especially after Herod Antipas had John the Baptist, his cousin, beheaded. So really, Jesus stayed away. He wanted nothing to do with Herod. Here is Cana. Cana is where the first miracle took place, where Jesus turned water into wine at a wedding that he attended at that time. That was his first miracle in Galilee. And here is Nain. You remember we talked about Nain? That's where Jesus entered Nain, and as he was coming in, he saw this funeral procession leaving the city. And there was a woman, a widow, whose son had just died, and he went to the widow. We heard about this in Amazing Faith. He went to the widow. He didn't say a word to her except, "Don't cry, don't weep." The lady, the widow, said nothing to him, said nothing this whole episode, but he went to her son and raised him, brought him back to life, and delivered him back to his mother. And there wasn't a word that she said or he said, as far as we can tell, the man. But that's amazing. That was in Amazing Faith. Maybe she had amazing faith, we don't know. But this is where that happened. Okay. Let's get back to this episode that we're looking at today. So it happened over here. Now, if we go to the next slide, I copied this out of Google Earth. This is a present-day picture of the Sea of Galilee and what's around it. And if you can see it in this area, you can see that it's a little bit hilly, where otherwise it's pretty kind of a coastal area, kind of plain, flat. But here there's hills. And the city that we're talking about would be at that time, I guess it's not there anymore, it would be right in this area somewhere. So he was in this area when it happened. How he got there, we don't know. We don't know where he took off from. Might have been up here, but we just don't know. I don't know. I don't think those boats really, in those days, got too far out on the sea. Now, I may be wrong on that. They went fishing, but I don't think they really were fishing far off the shore. So he might have just had a short distance to go, or maybe he left from around here somewhere and had a little longer distance. I just don't know. Well, let's look at the next slide. And this is another Google Earth that I took, but I took it from the standpoint, I got it from the standpoint of the Sea of Galilee. This is Sea of Galilee here. These are the hills that we're talking about. They're not mountains, they're just hills, but they can be steep in areas, and this is where the swine was at. I don't know if this is exactly the place. That's a big coastline that's up there, but this is kind of typical of what that coastline looks like. And so that's where the pigs were. It happened to say that the pigs was up here, and they just went running down the slope into the sea. I think that's interesting myself. I like to look at things like that and see what the situation is that we're reading about. And this is what it looks like over there. Well, let's go to the next slide. And I want to look at Matthew 8, 28 to 34 now. Let's do that. Let's go to Matthew, and we'll go to Matthew 8, 28. Matthew doesn't give it as much treatment as Luke does, but let's have a look at it from his standpoint. When he came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes, they use a little different term here, but it all means the same thing. 2 demonics coming out of the tombs met him. They were so fierce that no one could pass that way. Suddenly they shouted, "What have you to do with me, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" They're talking about the time that Jesus is going to cast them back into the abyss. Now a large herd of swine was feeding at some distance from them. The demons begged him, "If you cast us out, send us into the herd of swine." And he said to them, "Go." And they came out and entered the swine, and suddenly the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and perished in the water. The swineherds ran off. These are the people who take care of the swine. Ran off, and on going into the town, they told the whole story about what had happened to the demonics. Then the whole town came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to leave their neighborhood. And after getting into a boat, he crossed the sea and came to his own town. So let's now go to Mark 5, because I want to look at it. Mark 5:1. And Mark gives it a little more of a treatment, 1 through 20. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him any more, even with a chain, for he had often been restrained with shackles and chains. But the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now see, here's where the demons is a little bit different. He begged Jesus not to send them out of the country, which would make you think that maybe there is a region that these demons were in. Now there on the hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demonic sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demonic and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. That side of the Sea of Galilee that we were looking at, and we looked at that city, that whole area in there is called Decapolis because that's where the Greeks built 10 cities. And so that's how they named that whole area over there on that side of the sea. Well, we see a little bit of difference between Mark and Matthew and Luke. Mark and Luke compare pretty favorably, but Matthew's a little bit different in that he has two demonics. And as I was pointing out last week, or several weeks ago perhaps, Mark, scholars believe that Mark was the first book of the gospel that was written, and that Matthew wrote his primarily using Mark. And then Luke used Mark and Matthew and other information as well as some oral traditions. It would appear, though, that Mark had a little different story he wanted to tell than Matthew. And Matthew shortened down what Mark had written for his own purposes, because his purpose was to talk to the Jews. He wanted to talk to the people in the Jews and proclaim to him how Jesus Christ is the way to the future, not the Pharisees or the other beliefs that they might have. Well, anyway, if we look at that, we can see that in Matthew, there's 2 demonics, and both were probably healed. In Mark and Luke, there's nothing that would suggest there wasn't 2, but they focused on 1. And maybe for the purpose of getting the message across, they did that. But there might have been 2 of them there. In Mark, he mentions 1 demonic, and in Luke, he mentions 1 demonic. But he also brings out another fact, is that the man was originally from the city. And we didn't get that from Mark and Matthew. But the man was from the city. So he might have been a prosperous merchant. We don't know what he was. But somehow or another, he became possessed by these demons. But I think the people there knew him. And when they came and saw him sitting there in his right mind, they knew who that was because they knew him before he was possessed by demons, I believe. That's my opinion. But I think that's correct, that he probably was known to the people. And if the people knew him, he was probably somewhat of an important person in that city to begin with. We also learn, I believe it was in Mark, where there was 2,000 swine, 2,000 pigs, which is a pretty good herd. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about what we don't know. Nowhere in the Bible does it explain how the people became demon-possessed, and Jesus never asked about it. Have you noticed that when you read these about him casting out demons? We don't know how they became possessed by demons, and Jesus never asked. One time, as he was coming down from his episode with transfiguration, and the Father brought his son, I mentioned this when we were talking about a lack of faith, where the Father brought his son to Jesus, and he said, can you heal him? And Jesus said, well, this is a lack of faith. Can I? Of course I can. That's what the implication is. And he did ask the Father at that time, how long has he been possessed? And the Father said, since childhood. And he was fairly grown by this time. But that's the only time that I know that Jesus even asked anything about how long he'd been possessed. And he never asked, how did he become possessed by demons? We just don't know. Jesus cast them out. He cast them as unclean spirits. But how they got that way, we don't know. We don't know. We just know that he cast them out. Present day, they said it's mentally challenged people. Well, let's go on. This is the first and only time the people were not happy with Jesus casting out the demons. Now, why is that? Everybody previous to this and after this were happy that those demons were cast out. These people didn't. These people would just soon have the demonic there as Jesus. They didn't want him there. And they weren't happy with what he was doing. Let's go on. The people were more afraid of Jesus than the demonic. Now, why is that? The demonic was strong. They couldn't subdue him. Evidently, he wasn't harming anybody. He was just living there among the tombs, naked, running around. But they were more afraid of Jesus than they were of the demonic. And why did the people ask Jesus to leave the territory? Again, we're back in that regional aspect of it. They asked him to get in his boat and leave the territory. They didn't want any more of this casting out of demons or anything else that Jesus might do. Well, why is that? Why did they do that? Why was he not acceptable, but in fact was rejected there? Well, that's something that we need to look at. If we go to the next slide, possible answers. Probably, I'm thinking that there was probably 2 demonics, since the name of the demonic given Jesus was Legion, meaning a great multitude. There's a great multitude. There were 2,000 sheep. Now, if one demon went into one sheep, one pig, then that means there were 2,000 demons. That's a lot of demons for one. I'm thinking more that there were 2 people with a 1,000 demons each, you know. Usually Mary of Magdalene only had 7. This was kind of the common thing where you'd have maybe 1 to 7 or something, but now we're talking thousands. This was really unique. And I think probably there were 2 demonics there, but Luke and Mark decided just to focus on 1. The other one would go along with the same way. That's my opinion. I don't know. Maybe Matthew said 2 and made 2 out of it. Where he got his information, I don't know. But I'm thinking, but most people say they really do believe there were 2 there, because Mark and Luke didn't say anything about there not being 2. They just talked about 1 of them. And today, we say people facing mental challenges rather than being demon-possessed. In fact, in one, I'm trying to remember, I looked in one translation of the Bible, and it said that it was epilepsy. It was in the Bible that one of the boy I'm talking about now, not these demonics, but in the story I just told you about, the father who brought the son to him, and with a weak faith there, and when Jesus said, "What can I do it?" Of course I can do it. The disciples, you remember, couldn't do it. They tried, but they couldn't cast out that demon. Jesus could and did. And in the version, the translation I was looking at said he was an epileptic child, and that was epilepsy that was causing him to do this. Well, that's whoever translated that. That's the way he understood it, and that's what he put in it. I looked in the King James Version for that same thing, and he called it a lunatic. The boy was a lunatic. So you can translate that any way you want to. He can either be demon-possessed, or he could have epilepsy, or he could be a lunatic. But anyway, point is, Jesus cured him, whatever his problem was. I had a classmate one time that had epilepsy, and he never had an episode when I was around him, but he would tell me about it. And it is a scary thing, because they just come randomly. You don't know when it could be. He couldn't drive a car. He couldn't do anything because he would be subject to that seizure, and you didn't know when it was going to happen at all, day or night. And so he did not have a good life. When I went back, it was a classmate in high school when I was going to high school in Texas, and I went back for the 25th reunion. I didn't graduate from that school, incidentally, but they always invite me back. I went 3 years there. They invite me back to their reunions. And I talked to him. I met him, and I talked to him, and he was telling me about things that had happened to him since he had epilepsy, and he couldn't get a job. Nobody would hire him. But he finally got a job in a delivery truck. And he told me that one day he had to go with another man. The other man was the driver, and the 2 of them then unloaded the truck and whatever. But he was not to drive. That was made perfectly clear to him. He was not to drive. He just to help with the unloading. But coming back from Arkansas into Oklahoma, he said we had just crossed the bridge to get into Oklahoma from Fort Smith, and he was driving. He said the other guy wanted him to drive and rest a little bit, and he had a seizure, and he wrecked the truck, and so he was fired immediately. And things like that happen, and he was living in the hometown, his hometown, but his father worked on an oil rig and fell off the rig and broke his back, so his father was really an invalid and couldn't work. His mother died later on, so he was having a rough time, and he had to stay with his father. And I suppose he got some care money from the state or whatever to help him. But he didn't have a good life. He had a pretty rough life. And he was just as good a kid as you'd ever want to meet, just as nice and friendly. But he just had a handicap, and it was terrible. And then I went back for my 50th class reunion and discovered that he was dead. And he told me one time, and it was really a sad thing. I know you're probably not interested in this, but he told me that one night he got into bed with a shotgun. He was going to commit suicide. He just had enough of this, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. When I went back for the 50th reunion and they told me he had passed away, I asked him, I said, well, how did he die? Because I was concerned about what he had done. And as it turned out, he did not commit suicide, but he did develop cancer, and the cancer killed him. But he, never forget that. He was really a good kid, just had a handicap. But anyway, to get back to the point, some people say that the man who was demon possessed really had a mental problem. That was his problem, and Jesus cured him. People were unhappy with Jesus, not because of the economic and environmental disaster of 2,000 pigs drowning and washing up on shore, but because of his power over the spirit world. I don't think they didn't say anything about the pigs drowning or the economic loss. They looked at the man and saw the man was healed and that he was in his right mind and he could talk to him and converse with him. He was okay again. And that scared them. That scared what Jesus could do. And quite frankly, they didn't want Jesus to do that in their territory. And another interesting point is the demons knew Jesus, knew he had the power to send them to the abyss, hell, and begged him to allow them to go to the pigs and not to hell. They knew how bad hell is. Now the question is, at this point, is if the demons who are going to be assigned to hell, know how bad it is, why do some people, even today, say they want to go to hell? They just don't know what they're getting into, do they? They just don't know. But people do say that. They say, I want to go to hell. Now, I worked with a guy one time that he didn't tell me he wanted to go to hell, but he told me he didn't want to go to heaven. And why? Because none of his friends are going to be there. He said, I don't want to go to heaven. None of my friends are going to be there. So there's any number of reasons why people don't accept Jesus Christ, but they just don't know what awaits them. And if you tell them, they probably won't believe it, whatever. But it's our job to tell them anyway and try to save them. I've had people tell me that money was their God. I've had people tell me, like he did, that he doesn't want to go to heaven. I've had people tell me I've gone to church, there's just nothing there for me. There's any number of reasons why people don't accept Jesus Christ. They'll say, I don't need God in my life. Any number of reasons. And you're going to find that. If you go out and talk to people, you're going to find all types of reasons why they don't want to accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. But they don't know what's going to await them on that. And we need to talk to them. We need to await them and help them as much as we can to accept Jesus, because it's going to be a terrible thing if you don't. Yeah. Those who are afraid to accept Jesus now are just the same way as they. Exactly right. You got the point. And I'm going to make that point later on. But that is exactly right. They don't want God in their life. Why? They don't want change. They like their life just the way it is. And that is an excellent point. I've often thought now, just thinking about it, that when you get high on drugs, or you become intoxicated with liquor, you lose control of your mind. You're drunk, you're high. And you do things that you normally wouldn't do because of that. And I thought, if you don't have control of your mind, and I'm not talking about Alzheimer's or anything like that. I'm just talking about people who get high and intoxicated and do things that they normally wouldn't do and probably can't remember they did. Your mind is open, and if there's demons, they could enter into it right then, and they can make you do things that you wouldn't normally do. And maybe you've heard stories about people that have done things. They've put animals in microwaves. They put babies in microwaves. They've done things that you just wouldn't do if you were in your right mind. And when they sober up, they might not even be able to remember what they've done. So there may be demons coming in, and they take advantage of you. If your mind is open and you haven't got control of it, they may be in there in just a minute. Fortunately, when you sober up, they're out of there. But it could be a temporary thing for them. I've often thought about that, and I thought, boy, that's a dangerous thing. Don't get high and don't get drunk, because you don't know what's going to happen to you. And I've seen that. I've seen people who are just normal people during the day, but they get drunk and they do things that they'll get a gun and go after somebody, or they'll start a fight. And they normally wouldn't do things like that. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Just continued. Why were they afraid of Jesus? They were afraid of Jesus because he could cast out demons, heal the sick, raise the dead, forgive sins, attract great crowds, and generally agitate the ruling class. When the ruling class is usually the ones that like things to be the same, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and whatnot. And many of today's people, they want things to be the same. They don't want you coming in, making change. And where Jesus goes, he makes changes. He'll change your life. If you don't want your life changed, then you don't want Jesus in it. And this is what we were saying. And I'm thinking that the leader, when the people came out to see Jesus on the other side of the lake, it was probably the leaders of the people that were talking to him. And they were saying, hey, we like things the way they are over here. Now, they weren't isolated. They knew probably what was going on. They probably had heard of Jesus before. They didn't know him. They hadn't seen him. This was the first time, but they probably knew what he was doing in Galilee. Word probably came over to them what he was doing, and they didn't want any part of it. So they said, get out of our territory, please. Now, you ask Jesus or God to leave, he's going to leave. And that's what he did. He got in the boat and sailed back. He's not going to stay where you don't want him. And so we'll get into that a little bit later on too, but he did leave. I think that's exactly right. When Jesus went, wherever Jesus went, he caused change, and many people do not want change. And then why did Jesus come? Let's look at why did he come to earth? Let's look at that. Isaiah 61. Isaiah 61, 1-3. This, incidentally, is what Jesus read to the Jews in the synagogue in Nazareth when they got mad at him and wanted to get rid of him. And he was amazed again, but he was amazed at the lack of faith that these people were showing. Well, let's read 61:1 from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. That's why he came, and he talked mostly to the poor and the common people of the Jews. He didn't talk to the Pharisees or the Sadducees. He did, and he did try to convert them and tell them where they might be wrong, but he really didn't come for those people. He said himself he came to the sinners and not to the righteous. Well, let's go and say, how was he received? That's why he came. How was he received? Let's go to John. John 1:1-5 first. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Let's jump down to verse 10 now. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. So they were born again of God. But his people didn't accept him. The Jews did not accept Jesus. Many people still do not accept Jesus. You know, Jesus traveled for several years in Judah and Galilee, and he saved some people and he helped some people, but many more didn't receive him. Many more didn't accept him. They went on, just like today. Some do and most don't. Mm-hmm. I think, well, most people I've discovered believe there's a God. I think 70% of the people in America believe there's a God, maybe more. But I'll tell you one thing, the fastest growing group in America today are the atheists. Now, and there are many of those who believe there's a God, they just don't accept him. They don't want him. And why don't they want him? Why don't they want everlasting life? They don't want change. They don't want to make a change. And whenever Jesus comes in, he makes changes. He'll change a country. He'll change a person. And many don't want to change. And that was the problem with the people on the other side of Galilee. They didn't want to make changes. Now, just briefly, I want to make a point here. Let me get a drink of water. They don't want to be. Well, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Free. Yeah. Well, yeah, they just don't want to be changed. There they are. The thing that gets me is when you look at what was going on, say, in Galilee, and I'm going to try to make a quick point here. Who was really against Jesus? Many of the people rejected him in the fact that they wouldn't listen to him. But there was really only a certain number of people that were opposed to him. And get to the point. They were the elites of the area. They were the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed in the letter of the law. They did not follow the spirit of the law. And Jesus wanted both. He said you should follow the letter of the law and you should follow the spirit of the law. Why was that law given? What was the purpose of it? That's what you need to follow too. The Pharisees thought that Jesus was undermining them. So they set about saying, I'm going to undermine Jesus. Let's go on down south to the temple. Sadducees controlled the temple. And the temple had a good thing going for them. They didn't want change. The chief priest was rich. He cooperated with the Romans. The Sanhedrin was composed of rich people. They didn't want change. What did Jesus do when he entered the temple? He said, you've turned God's temple into a den of thieves. He said, this temple is going to be torn down. Well, the chief priests couldn't tolerate that, and neither could the Sanhedrin. They wanted Jesus dead. They feared Jesus, if you would. He's going to get the people to come in and believe him, and then our deal is gone. And they were making a lot of money out of it. Follow the money, I think, as far as the Sadducees are concerned. They didn't want change. And the Pharisees didn't want change. The establishment didn't want change. And so I started thinking about that, and I thought, well, we're in that same condition today in the United States. Aren't we? I think so. Who controls America today? You hear it all the time on the news. It's the establishment. They control the banks. They control the economy. They control the government. They control health care. They don't want change. They want to control you. We hear about some of the presidential candidates who want a flat tax and eliminate the IRS. You think they got a chance to do that? I really don't. The IRS is more than a tax gatherer, aren't they? They're a way to control the people. They determine who gets tax-exempt status. They can take it away from the churches anytime they want to. It's a way to control things. They're not going to get rid of the IRS because the establishment wants to control you. And we hear a lot today about the Republican establishment. They don't want Trump. They don't want Cruz because they're anti-establishment. Mike Huckabee, even a Baptist minister, was talking about it. He wants to make change. He wants a flat tax. He wants to eliminate the IRS. You think he's going to? Well, Mike Huckabee can't get traction with the people, so he's not going to. Republican establishment's hoping for a contested convention where they can maybe slip in their own man, like a Mitt Romney or somebody like that. Why? Because they can control them. They can control those guys. They can't control a Cruz. They can't control a Trump. Or they can't control a Mike Huckabee. Now, that's my opinion. That's why. It's just the same situation. What do you do in a case like this? Who's trying to make the change? It's the conservatives. And who are the conservatives? They're the evangelicals. Many of them are. Many of them are Southern Baptist in the South. They're the ones that want to make the change. And so what's the establishment going to do? I think they're going to try, again, this is tough, but I think they're going to try to destroy Christianity. And so far, they're doing a pretty good job of it. How do you do that? You do what Satan's been doing for years. Number one, you destroy the family. How do you destroy the family? Well, you authorize and legalize same-sex marriage and abortions. And you have a welfare system that favors people, unmarried women, going out and having as many babies as they can. Having women having maybe 5 kids, each by a different father. You do that. That's what the welfare system promotes. That's what destroying families. You take God out of schools. They've done that. You take God out of the government. They're doing it. And even now, they're trying to get God out of the military. They haven't been successful, but they're trying to do that. So what's happening? Same thing that Satan's trying to do. Get God and Christians out. The two things that, and it's scary to me, because I think that's what's happening. The two things you need to do is just follow Nazi Germany and communist Russia and communist China. Two things that are necessary to do that is to get rid of God and Jesus Christ and get rid of the guns out of the hands of the people. Those are the first things that you do when you try to take over. And I think the establishment doesn't want change, and I think they're going, I'm not saying that's going to happen in America, but what I am saying is the establishment doesn't want change. They want everything to stay the same because they're in control and that's the way they want it. And to me, that's scary. And that's why, as David Jordan said last week, we're only one generation away from losing Christianity. And we're losing it. Like I said, the fastest growing group today is the atheist. Why? Because the kids aren't learning about God. They're not coming to church. They're not learning it in schools. And when you grow up, you're an atheist. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I had a college professor in a humanities class that I had to take to graduate, and he stood up and he wanted us to study the Bible, at least some chapters in the Bible. He said, this is a beautiful work of art. He says, it's all fairy tales. There's not a word in it that's true, but it's beautiful to read. And we're going to study it from that standpoint. But yeah, he didn't. Incidentally, that man collapsed. I think he had a stroke while he was teaching. It wasn't at that point in time, but he did. But it was, but that's what he believed. It's all fairy tales, but it's excellent literature, so you can read it. But that's the way a lot of people approach the Bible. Yeah. Yeah. That's really all that I have. I wanted to say, I hope I didn't get anybody mad at me for saying things like that, but that's the way I believe. And it just, when I was doing this and looking at it, I thought, boy, isn't that very similar to what's happening today in America? And we've got to stand up. It's been said that we are no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We are a government of lobbyists, by the lobbyists, and for the lobbyists. And I think that's right. The big money people are the ones that's calling the shots here. And when we do, we got to make a change. And I'm all for making a change. We just need to get the right people in, and that's tough. The right people don't really want to run for president, but we do need to get the right people in. I've got one other thing, if I may. It's just something that I read, and I liked it very much. Kind of goes along with what I'm saying. We need to get out and evangelize a little bit, evangelize Shawnee. I was thinking there may only be about 20 to 25% of the citizens in Shawnee that go to church on an active basis. There's Shawnee's 30,000 people, and maybe 6,000 people, maybe 7, I don't know. I think Emmanuel Baptist, one of the largest churches, I think they have about 1,000 a Sunday. I think Life Church TV up here on up just north of town, I've heard they've had as many as 2,000. I don't know if that's correct or not. I'm just heard that. So there's 3,000. And if you add up all of the other churches around the Shawnee area, maybe you get another 3,000. You got 6,000 people, that's 20% of the total population. So the mission field out there is large. If we could just get out there and tap into it and bring people into Jesus Christ. Well, anyway, I want to read an article that I found. This came out of the Tri-County Herald. Maybe some of you in the north part, up around McLeod, Meeker, North Rock Creek, Dale, that area, this paper is directed towards you. It's, but anyway, this is a short piece that was written by Pastor Mike Hazelwood of the Mammoth Baptist Church. Isn't Mammoth Baptist Church the one that's on 177 just north of Highway 62? There's a Baptist church right up there. Isn't that Mammoth? It's Mike Hazelwood. He's the pastor there at Mammoth Baptist Church. Let me tell you what he's read. And it goes along with what David Jordan was preaching about last Sunday. It is the privilege and duty of the people of God to tell the old story. The old story will be my glory. Isn't there a hymn like that somewhere? If we don't, who will? Recounting God's praise is in part proclaiming the message of the Bible, that God loved the whole world so much that he gave his only Son, so that whosoever fully trusts in him will not perish but have eternal life. But another part of recounting God's praise is sharing how God has worked and what he has done in our own lives. God is not just the God of the past. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. When we fail to give witness to our great God, the whole world suffers. Patrick Henry said, "It is when people forget God that tyrants forge their chains." Isn't that the truth? And that's what's happening in the country today. In the midst of a broken United States embroiled in civil war in 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued a Thanksgiving proclamation with these words, and I quote, "We have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us, and we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us." Quotes closed. Perhaps it is time that we call for a recount of God's blessing and give him praise for his faithful love, which extends to all generations. Thought that was pretty good. And there's others, but I'm not going to do them now because it's time to quit. Thank you. Well, let's close.